In this lecture, we're going to be learning about perspective. Now right here, I have the definition of perspective, so let me just read it real quick. Perspective is the art of drawing solid objects on a two-dimensional surface so as to give the right impression of their height, width, depth, and position in relation to each other when viewed from a particular point. So what this means is it basically just means that if you're standing in a certain place or certain height or something like that, the size, the placement, the height, all of these factors that go into drawing something are all going to change depending on the position to the viewer. So let's have a look at a few examples. You're probably already relatively familiar with perspective. So the first one we have right here. So right here we have an image of a girl with a skyscraper behind her. And the first thing you'll notice is that the further away the skyscraper gets up into the sky, the smaller it becomes. You'll also notice that the same thing happens to this woman. So down here, her body is a little bit bigger and larger than it is up here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to turn on this layer that I've drawn the actual perspective lines on this. So you can see that we have all these lines and they all go up to a point that kind of goes off the screen. But you can see that they're all basically coming in the same direction and connecting at one point. You'll also see that I drew a cube here to kind of represent the perspective of her head. So if we're drawing the simple geometric form of her head, let's say it's a cube, just to keep things simple, it lines up with this perspective. And her body could line up with that perspective as well. And you'll notice that the reason why things get smaller the further away they get is because they get out here to what's called the vanishing point. You'll learn a lot more about this later in this section, but the main thing you need to understand is that basically with perspective, the further away something gets, the smaller it is, and the closer to the viewer, the larger it is. Let's have a look at another example. Now, this is actually called foreshortening when this happens. When objects are closer to the viewer, or you could say the camera, objects are much bigger. So you'll notice here that her foot is a lot bigger than, let's say, her other foot back here. You'll also notice that her foot is much bigger than her head, which doesn't actually make sense in real life if you were to hold them right next to each other. We all know that a foot is smaller or at least the same size as a head. But right here, this head is much larger, or this foot is much larger. And the reason for that is because of perspective, and it's causing foreshortening. So you always want to remember that things that are much closer to the camera are going to be larger. But when you draw this, you want to make sure that you're actually using perspective lines. You don't always want to just guess. There are times where you can guess, but most of the time you want to be using perspective lines. So you can see right here, if I turn on my perspective line drawing, you can see that I broke her foot down into a simple rectangular cube type shape, which falls into this perspective line. Her leg also falls into this perspective. And you'll see that this perspective also applies all the way up here into the ceiling. We have these bars. If I go ahead and turn this drawing off real quick so you can see them, we have these support beams up here in the ceiling, and they also follow the same basic perspective. Now let's go ahead and have a look at another example. So our next example is going to be architecture. You see this a lot in architecture or bridges, things that go off very far into the distance. And you've probably already noticed that in real life or in photographs, things that are far away become smaller. So even though we know that the Golden Gate Bridge is a constant height all the way across it, so this guy right here and this other guy over here are the same height in reality. But in this photograph, this one back here is much smaller, and that's because it's following perspective. So if we turn on our perspective lines, you can see that this rectangular shape here becomes much smaller when we follow this perspective line on the bottom and on the top. Another thing I want to point out about this photograph is you'll notice that the further away this bridge gets, the lighter it becomes. And that's because of something called atmospheric perspective. Things that are further away, so such as these mountains back here, become much lighter. And we'll get way more into that later in this section. Next, let's have a look at our last example. Another thing we can do with perspective is we can warp perspective. So this photograph, you'll notice that it's actually kind of warped. It has a fisheye lens that's taken the picture. And so all of our straight horizon lines, our perspective lines are actually curved. So if I go ahead and I turn on my perspective lines, you'll see that I have one straight line here, but then everything on the bottom of that line is curved down in this direction, and anything above this line is curved like this. And you'll also notice that we have lines that go up like this that also get curved. So basically, every single line becomes warped and curved. So we can always warp and manipulate these perspective lines to look the way we want them to, or to change the type of lens that let's say if it was a photograph, but we want to convert it into a drawing, we can change the lens on it into something that captures more of a 180-degree view. All right, that brings us to the end of this lecture. The main thing you want to remember about perspective is that the further away things get, the smaller they become. I'll see you in the next lecture.